There is unity in the oppression. There must be absolute unity and determination in the response. There is unity in the oppression. There must be absolute unity and determination in the response. There is unity in the oppression.
But he will be back next week. As we know, Julian Assange is a wanted man because he has published classified information given to him by whistleblowers that has revealed the crimes and corruption of government officials around the world, but particularly in the United States. The US, the supposed beacon of freedom and democracy around the globe, wants him extradited to the United States for the crime of publishing. Assange has interfered with the interests of some of the most powerful people in the world by revealing their hidden deeds to the public. Those powerful interests want him to pay. That's why Julian Assange has been a refugee in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for the past 6 years, though he has not been charged with a crime by either the UK or Sweden. He knows the second he steps back onto British territory, he will be arrested and sent to the US, where he is unlikely to receive a fair trial and would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. It is a historic test of press freedom. The corporate media, which once profited from him, has now abandoned Julian Assange, and they could face the same threat to their freedom to publish classified information were he to be arrested and tried. And now we turn to the headlines of the past week before we get into our discussion. WikiLeaks tweeted in the last 24 hours, quote, "What is a US Department of Justice jet doing in London? The jet arrived on Tuesday from DC and was last noted rendering alleged Russian hacker Yevgeny Nikulin to the US last year from the Czech Republic, causing a diplomatic incident with Russia." And Christine Assange also commented on this news, tweeting in response, quote, "This is of urgent and real concern. Under the cover of the 24/7 media frenzy on the New Zealand mosque shootings, is the US planning to snatch my son Julian from the London, Ecuador embassy they have been trying to force him from for a CIA rendition flight? And clearly, this news, though so far unacknowledged by establishment press, raises serious concerns regarding the possibility that this jet is intended for the unlawful extradition of Julian Assange. We also just recently, in the last 30 minutes, saw a very, sort of urgent tweet by WikiLeaks saying, quote, a buildup of plainclothes, earpiece-wearing operatives around the Ecuador embassy in London in the last 2 days has been cited by Julian Assange's lawyers. There are normally 2 to 4 plainclothes British operatives present. The reason for the increase is not publicly known. And so obviously we will, during this vigil, we will keep everyone up to date as we can. We will comment on any developing events as they occur. But that is the extent of our knowledge on that incident so far. To provide some context for these events, though, we look to an article from Cyberscoop, which reported the statements of Nikulin's lawyers, who, again, was the alleged Russian hacker that was extradited on this same plane. His lawyers said he was subsequently placed in solitary confinement in July last year. The Cyberscoop article says, quote, Nikulin faces charges of hacking data from the US tech firms LinkedIn, Dropbox, and Formspring. Nikulin, who denies all charges, has been in solitary for 2 months, defense lawyer Arkady Book told Cyberscoop. And meanwhile, Radio Praha, and again, this is just to provide context on this previous incident with this particular jet. Radio Praha, which is a Czech radio outlet, described Nikulin's arrest as, quote, effectively without warning and swift, coming overnight on March 30, following a decision by Czech Justice Minister Robert Pelikan. Neither Nikulin's lawyer or Russian officials were informed in advance of the move. And so, obviously this is a really serious development. And again, we will be keeping you as informed as we can over the next few hours and going forward. But moving on to a separate piece of news, WikiLeaks also tweeted recently a statement from Julian Assange's DC lawyer, Barry Polak, in relation to congressional requests for documents from WikiLeaks, saying, and Barry Polak said, quote, the First Amendment dictates that any inquiry by Congress should not begin by issuing requests to journalists for documents pertaining to its news gatherings. Let me just check the news 1 second. Okay, and we also have a new tweet from WikiLeaks tweeting pre-commitments. So I won't read out all of the numbers and letters from that, but it is another new tweet from WikiLeaks. So returning to our news of the week. As we know, a grand jury has been ongoing since 2010 under the veil of secrecy in attempts to prosecute Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for publishing classified material. Chelsea Manning was recently jailed for her refusal to testify before this same grand jury. Kevin Gosztola of Shadowproof published an article titled, Chelsea Manning and her attorneys believe the grand jury investigation into WikiLeaks may be trying to draw her into a, quote, perjury trap, according to unsealed court documents. And I will now be reading to you all a substantial section from Gosztola's article as it provides important context on the latest developments in Chelsea Manning's case. Gosztola writes, quote, Manning is in jail at the William G. Truesdale Adult Detention Center in Alexandria, Virginia, which is also where the grand jury is impaneled. She was charged with contempt on March 8 for refusing to answer questions before the grand jury. The government offered her some form of immunity for her testimony, and the United States military has offered a parallel form of immunity to assuage concerns that her testimony would open her up to further military prosecution. Government prosecutors seem interested in a lengthy statement Manning offered during her military court-martial for Espionage Act-related offenses, where she outlined her role in disclosing over 500,000 documents. She meticulously described each set of information, why she was drawn into releasing the documents to the public, and how she downloaded, prepared, and electronically transferred the documents to WikiLeaks. Moira Meltzer-Cohen, an attorney for Manning, suggested during a hearing on March 5, if the government intended to question her about her statement, quote, she's sort of faced with the choice of reiterating her previous answers, which the government appears not to accept, or being untruthful, which she refuses to do. And that's the end of that quote. But the attorney continued saying, quote, since her prior testimony made clear that she acted alone, and since we have been advised that she is herself not a target in this investigation, it would appear that the government may harbor an interest in undermining her previous testimony, since it doesn't inculpate anyone who might be a target, Meltzer-Cohen added. The government has filed sealed charges against WikiLeaks editor-in-chief Julian Assange. And again, this is Kevin Gostola's writing in Shadowproof. Presumably, prosecutors would like Manning to say something that could be used against Assange or any other WikiLeaks staffers who may have worked on the publication of her disclosures. Gostola continued, saying Manning's attorneys suggested during this hearing that prosecutors have led Manning to believe she may have made statements during her court-martial that were incorrect or in some way at variance with her prior statements. She also recognizes the public resentment towards her that has been expressed by other actors in the government. Meltzer Cohen proposed the government make a show of good faith and disclose whatever prior statements they seem to be relying on to justify the subpoena. This would be whatever prosecutors have from Manning that they believe contradicts her statements at the court-martial. Judge Claude Hilton rejected Manning's effort to quash the subpoena at this hearing, agreeing that with the government that raising First, Fourth, and Sixth Amendment rights was, quote, premature. The nature of Manning's claims requires that she hear the questions before determining whether the subpoena violates her rights, the government maintained in their reply to her motion. Prosecutors additionally asserted that she had to appear before the grand jury before she could challenge any questions on First Amendment grounds, saying, quote, the time for her to raise a First Amendment defense is only in response to a particular question. And that was the end of the quotation from Kevin Gostola's article in Shadowproof. But I'd like to add, in observation of the government's position that Chelsea Manning can't raise First Amendment objections until specific questions are asked of her, and that is that it seems to me impossible and immoral to demand that a witness participate in such a procedure without counsel present, without the ability to defend themselves. As multiple guests have discussed in previous Unity 4J vigils, the grand jury process is totally different to other forms of legal procedure. In future vigils, of course, we will continue to update our listeners and viewers on this case, which is fundamentally intertwined with that of Assange and WikiLeaks and attempts to prosecute them. As reported earlier this week by Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News and, of course, co-host of these vigils, Twitter mysteriously restricted the account of Christine Assange, Julian Assange's mother, without explanation. Lauria wrote for Consortium News, quote, the Twitter account of Christine Assange, the mother of the arbitrarily detained founder of WikiLeaks, has been restricted, she told Consortium News on Tuesday. My Twitter account has been blocked due to unusual activity, Mrs. Assange wrote in a text message. Twitter, however, has provided her no reason for its action. Mrs. Assange is a prolific user of Twitter in her campaign to free her son, who has been a refugee in the Ecuador embassy in London since 2012. While a user can access her page by agreeing to view her profile, Mrs. Assange told Consortium News she is unable to post new tweets to her account or see anyone else's. In the past 10 days, Mrs. Assange tweeted direct replies to Hillary Clinton and John Bolton, the U.S. National Security Advisor. Bolton had tweeted on March 9, quote, U.S. military should use WikiLeaks for cyber warfare target practice, take down their capabilities, and prevent further harm to national security. Mrs. Assange her reply to Bolton is no longer visible under his tweet. 9 replies to Bolton are now unavailable. Mrs. Assange said in a text message that her reply began by calling Bolton's tweet fascist talk. And we know that sometime after the publication of that article I just read to you from, and more than 24 hours after the restriction of her account, the censorship by Twitter of Christine Assange's account was lifted, again, without explanation. As noted by Consortium News, Venezuela's Telesur was then hit with a similar restriction. Consortium News wrote, quote, hundreds of tweets were sent to the San Francisco-based company, Twitter, by supporters demanding that she regain access to her account. Ms. Assange tweeted at 10:33 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time on Wednesday, back on deck, many thanks to everyone contacting Twitter on my behalf, and thanks to Twitter for responding with a reconnect. Ms. Assange told Consortium News by phone that she has had no contact with Twitter and still does not know why her account was restricted and precisely why it was restored. She was unable to post new tweets or read anyone else's while the restriction was in place. On Thursday, Telesur English, the Venezuelan state broadcaster's English service, was hit with the same restrictions by Twitter, as had Mrs. Assange, who tweeted a complaint about it, saying, quote, Telesur English account has been supportive of my son, arbitrarily gagged and tortured journalist Julian Assange. They have been one of the few media outlets to actually factually update the public on his plight and the political context behind his persecution. Again, that was from Consortium News and the Twitter account of Christine Assange. In other news this week, Harper's Magazine published an article authored by James Goodale titled, quote, "Why Julian Assange Deserves First Amendment Protection." The article writes that overall, the same mainstream journalists who have treated Donald Trump's disparaging tweets about them as unprecedented threats to their freedom handled Julian Assange's indictment as a political story, another piece of the ongoing Trump-Russia saga. In fact, the Trump administration's prosecution of Assange represents a greater threat to the free press than all of the president's nasty tweets combined. If the prosecution succeeds, investigative reporting based on classified information will be given a near death blow. Julian Assange started WikiLeaks in 2006 with the stated purpose of providing a place for newsworthy information to be released on a confidential basis. The site came to widespread international notice a few years later when Assange obtained thousands of classified documents relating to the Iraq War from US Army soldier Chelsea Nee Bradley Manning. Assange in turn shared these documents with Le Monde, El País, Der Spiegel, The Guardian, The Times, and each of which was separately edited and published what they received. Amid the furor surrounding this publication, politicians from across the political spectrum, Senators Dianne Feinstein and Joseph Lieberman among them, called for Assange's prosecution. Barack Obama's Justice Department seriously considered indicting Assange under the Espionage Act and convened a grand jury for that purpose. The legal theory behind such a prosecution involves charging Assange with conspiring with Manning to release classified materials. Using this conspiracy theory, the Espionage Act would be made to apply to a reporter, not directly, but indirectly, by using the reporter's relationship with sources. In other words, the reporter would be made responsible for the actions of his sources, and Manning was eventually convicted under the Espionage Act for leaking to Assange. Goodale continues, the Justice Department has been enamored of this conspiracy approach since the time of the Pentagon Papers. In that case, Richard Nixon's DOJ attempted to enjoin the New York Times and later the Washington Post from publishing a 47-volume Defense Department study of the history of U.S. relations with Vietnam from 1945 to 1967, which had been classified top secret. I led the team of lawyers who defended the Times in that case. I had advised the Times that the government would attempt to enjoin publication and thereafter would attempt to prosecute the Times criminally. I also advised the Times that it would win any case brought against it in the Supreme Court on First Amendment grounds. In June 1971, the Times published 3 installments of the papers and was enjoined from further publication, as I had predicted. The Washington Post then picked up where the Times left off, and both papers ended up in the Supreme Court, which ruled in their favor. The court's decision is now widely considered a legal landmark, since it effectively determined that no injunction could be brought to stop publication of classified material. Since Assange has already published the leaks in question, he cannot be stopped from publishing. All the government can do is prosecute him criminally for obtaining or publishing the leaks in the first place. To date, there has never been a criminal prosecution for this type of behavior. Obama's Justice Department ultimately concluded that a prosecution of Assange would damage the First Amendment. Their decision effectively meant that Assange was entitled to the same constitutional protections given reporters. A Washington Post story about this decision quoted Obama officials who referred to the New York Times problem, i.e., the fact that any precedent set with respect to Assange could be applied to traditional journalistic entities. Trump's Justice Department has reversed course on this decision. When Jeff Sessions first came into office as Attorney General, he said that one of his top priorities would be going after Assange. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, then director of the CIA, said, quote, "It is time to call out WikiLeaks for what it really is, a non-state hostile intelligence service, often abetted by state actors like Russia," end quote. So sometime later, the article goes on, should Trump's Justice Department succeed in prosecuting Assange, the only safe course of action for a reporter would be to receive information from a leaker passively. As soon as a reporter actively sought the information or cooperated with the source, the reporter would be subject to prosecution. National security reporting, however, is not done by receiving information over the transom. It is naive to think that reporters can sit around waiting for leaks to fall in their laps. In a recent interview, the longtime investigative reporter Seymour Hersh told me that he obtains classified information through a process of, quote, seduction, in which he spends time trying to induce the source to give up information. If he isn't allowed to do that, he says, it's the end of national security reporting. And the article continues, saying it's clear that the Justice Department believes that such seduction creates a conspiracy between the leaker and the reporter. in its prosecution of the State Department employee Stephen Jin Woo Kim Woo Kim for leaking classified information about North Korea to a Fox News reporter, James Rosen, the DOJ stated in a sealed affidavit, it considered Rosen a co-conspirator. The DOJ filed the affidavit with the DC District Court in 2010 to gain access to Rosen's email, which showed him persuading Kim, asking for the leak time and time again until Kim finally relented. The affidavit was unsealed 3 years later to the shock of Rosen and many other journalists. When Fox News angrily protested that Rosen's First Amendment rights prevented him from being a co-conspirator, the Obama Justice Department assured Fox that it would not prosecute him. If this type of conspiracy theory were applied in a criminal trial, a court would end up examining every effort by a reporter to obtain information. It would criminalize the reporting process. Reporters and their publishers would argue that the First Amendment protected news gathering efforts such as Rosen's, but the result would be in doubt in every case. And the article goes on. It says, if reporters can be indicted for talking to their sources, it will mean that the government has created the equivalent of a UK Official Secrets Act, but through judicial fiat without any legislative action. One wonders whether the real reason that journalists will not support Assange is that they simply don't get it. They don't understand how a successful prosecution of Assange would threaten their ability to report. I would suggest that the focus of the mainstream press should not be on whether Assange meets the usual definition of a journalist or whether they approve of what he does. That's not the point. The point is that he carries out the functions of a journalist. He has First Amendment protections as they do and should not be prosecuted for what he does. If he is, we are all worse off for it. And that is the end of the article from Harper's. We also had, in the last week, Chris Hedges posted an article via Truthdig titled Chelsea Manning and the New Inquisition. And he writes, quote, the US government determined to extradite and try Julian Assange for espionage must find a way to separate what Assange and WikiLeaks did in publishing classified material leaked to them by Chelsea Manning from what the New York Times and the Washington Post did in publishing the same material. There is no federal law that prohibits the press from publishing government secrets. It is a crime, however, to steal them. The long persecution of Manning, who on March 8 was sent back to jail for refusing to testify before a grand jury, is about this issue. Hedges continues, saying, if Manning, a former army private, admits she was instructed by WikiLeaks and Assange in how to obtain and pass on the leaked material, which exposed US war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq, the publisher could be tried for the theft of classified documents. The prosecution of government whistleblowers was accelerated during the Obama administration, which under the Espionage Act charged 8 people with leaking to the media: Thomas Drake, Shemai Leibowitz, Stephen Kim, Manning, Donald Schatleben, Jeffrey Sterling, John Kiriakau, and Edward Snowden. By the time Donald Trump took office, the vital connection between investigative reporters and sources inside the government had been severed. Manning, who worked as an Army intelligence analyst in Iraq in 2009, provided WikiLeaks with over 500,000 documents copied from military and government archives, including the collateral murder video footage of an Army helicopter gunning down a group of unarmed civilians that included 2 Reuters journalists. She was arrested in 2010 and found guilty in 2013. The campaign to criminalize whistleblowing has, by default, left the exposure of government lies, fraud, and crimes to those who have the skills or access, as Manning and Edward Snowden did, needed to hack into or otherwise obtain government electronic documents. This is why hackers and those who publish their material, such as Assange and WikiLeaks, are being relentlessly persecuted. The goal of the corporate state is to shroud in total secrecy the inner workings of power, especially those activities that violate the law. Movement towards this goal is very far advanced. The failure of news organizations such as the New York Times and the Washington Post to vigorously defend Manning and Assange will soon come back to haunt them. The corporate state hardly intends to stop with Manning and Assange. The target is the press itself. Hedges continues, writing, if we actually had a functioning judicial system and an independent press, Manning would have been a witness for the prosecution against the war criminals he helped expose. Hedges wrote after he and Cornel West attended Manning's sentencing in 2013 at Fort Meade, Maryland. He would not have been headed, bound, and shackled. to the military prison at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His testimony would have ensured that those who waged war, illegal war, tortured and lied to the public, monitored electronic communications, and ordered the gunning down of unarmed citizens in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Yemen were sent to Fort Leavenworth's cells. If we had a functioning judiciary, that hundreds of papers, rapes, and murders Manning made public would be investigated. The officials and generals who lied to us when they said they did not keep a record of civilian dead would be held to account for the 109,032 violent deaths in Iraq, including those of 66,081 civilians. The pilots in the collateral murder video, which showed the helicopter attack on unarmed civilians in Baghdad that left 9 dead, including those 2 Reuters journalists, would be court-martialed. And Hedges goes on, saying Manning has always insisted her leak of the classified documents and videos was prompted solely by her own conscience. She has refused to implicate Assange in WikiLeaks. Earlier this month, although President Barack Obama in 2010 commuted her 35-year sentence after she served 7 years, was jailed again for refusing to answer questions before a secret grand jury investigating Assange and WikiLeaks. While incarcerated previously, Manning endured long periods in solitary confinement and torture. She twice attempted to commit suicide in prison. She knows from painful experience the myriad ways the system can break you psychologically and physically, and yet she has steadfastly refused to give false testimony in court on behalf of the government. Her moral probity and courage are perhaps the last thin line of defense for WikiLeaks and for its publisher, whose health is deteriorating in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he's been holed up since 2012. Manning, who was known as Bradley Manning in the army, has undergone gender reassignment surgery and needs frequent medical monitoring. Judge Claude M. Hilton, however, dismissed a request by her lawyers for house arrest. Manning was granted immunity by prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia, and because she had immunity, she was unable to invoke the Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination or to have her attorney present. The judge found her in contempt of court and sent her to a federal facility in Alexandria, Virginia, and Hilton, who has long been a handmaiden of the military and intelligence organs, has vowed to hold her there until she agrees to testify or until the grand jury is disbanded, which could mean 18 months or longer behind bars. Manning said any questioning of her by the grand jury is a violation of her First, Fourth, and Sixth Amendment rights. She said she will not cooperate with the grand jury. And she said, quote, all of the substantive questions pertained to my disclosures of information to the public in 2010, answers I provided in extensive testimony during my court-martial in 2013, and she said this on March 7, the day before she was jailed. She continued saying, I will not comply with this or any other grand jury, in a later statement issued from jail, saying, quote, imprisoning me for my refusal to answer questions only subjects me to additional punishment for my repeatedly stated ethical objections to the grand jury system. The grand jury's questions pertained to disclosures from 9 years ago that took place 6 years after an in-depth computer forensics case in which I testified for almost a full day about these events, she went on. I stand by my previous public testimony. Manning reiterated that she will not participate in this secret process that she morally objects to, particularly one that has been historically used to entrap and persecute activists for protected political speech. Hedges continues saying that what is taking place is a series of incremental steps designed to strangle the press and cement into place an American version of China's totalitarian capitalism. President Trump has often proclaimed his deep animus for news outlets such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, referring to them as, quote, the enemy of the people. Any legal tools given to the administration to shut down these news outlets, or at least hollow them of content, will be used eagerly by the president. The prosecutions of government whistleblowers under the Espionage Act, warrantless wiretapping, monitoring of the communications of Americans, and the persecution of Manning and Assange are parts of the interconnected process of preventing any of us from peering at the machinery of state. The resulting secrecy is vital for totalitarian systems. The global elites, their ruling ideology of neoliberalism exposed as a con, have had enough of us examining and questioning their abuses, pillage, and crimes. The internet, our greatest tool of emancipation, Assange writes, has been transformed into the most dangerous facilitator of totalitarianism we have ever seen. That is where we are headed. Hedges concludes. A few resist. Assange and Manning are two. Those who stand by passively as they are persecuted will be next. And that's the end of the article from Truthdig by Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. And we also this week saw the publication of an interview with WikiLeaks editor-in-chief Kristen Hafrenson, who was, and the interview was published by the Reykjavik Grapevine, which is an English language Icelandic magazine. The interview is very long, but states in part that Kristen felt that journalism had to be ethical but tough. And he told the Reykjavik Grapevine that, quote, the ideals that he followed at the time would probably be considered radical today. The accusation that journalism should be neutral in some way was a bit absent at the time. Being a journalist in Iceland for 20 years, he's gotten accusations of bias from all sides. And as he was telling a friend the other day, when you've had people shouting at you from all corners of the political spectrum, then you're probably doing your job right. The article also says that WikiLeaks appealed to Kristen's journalistic sensibilities. Quote, this was something that was adding to the transparency, he says. It was legally difficult to stop. On that basis, I sought out Julian Assange. He was invited to Iceland in the autumn of 2009. We met, befriended, and that led to my involvement. He goes on to say, quote, in journalism, WikiLeaks did two things. First, it showed the power of huge leaks of this nature and that you can really move things by exposing many aspects of corruption and war crimes. Second, we pulled together resources of the mainstream media. We demanded that people work together, which was often difficult. The organization created a media alliance with hundreds of outlets around the world. It laid the groundwork for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or ICIJ, cooperation on the Panama Papers, for example. This also inspired other whistleblowers. Edward Snowden has confirmed that if it hadn't been for those leaks in 2010, there would not have been Snowden leaks later on. And this work, though, has not been without criticism. And again, this is from the article published by the Reykjavik Grapevine, neither about WikiLeaks or its founder, Julian Assange. One of the most prominent criticisms about WikiLeaks is that they dump files without making any redactions. There is no filter to the information WikiLeaks might post, prompting what Kristen has described as counterspin, most prevalent after the collateral murder leak, that the release of unfiltered information could put innocent lives at risk. Kristen isn't having it, saying, quote, it was quite extraordinary to see the Joint Chief of Staff on television, almost in tears, over the supposed dangers, saying that WikiLeaks could already have blood on their hands for releasing this information. But this hasn't materialized. Information is never neutral. It can have adverse effects to some degree, but every journalist knows that. But to this day, there has not been a single incident from this biggest leak in military history exposing all these internal secrets of the most powerful military machine in the world. No harm has befallen anyone. No one has lost their lives. I'm pretty sure we would have heard about it if that would have happened. This was confirmed during Chelsea Manning's trial of 2013 by the Pentagon officials. The leak had not caused harm. Ultimately, the ethos of WikiLeaks is fairly simple. Everything should be in the public domain, except sensitive personal information. Transparency should be the norm, and exceptions from transparency should be very few and must be justified, Kristen explains. All freedom of information laws are based on that principle, but for some reason it doesn't seep in. We're still fighting this endless war against secrecy. And what people are missing about this story is the core principle here, Kristen says, that journalists are supposed to publish materials on politicians and especially candidates prior to election. That's the role of journalists. That's why it's called the fourth estate. It's totally amazing that even journalists are telling me, quote, you shouldn't have published the emails before the election, referring to the DNC and Podesta emails. And he says, are we not supposed to inform the electorate about the candidates? Isn't that our job? If you have internal information about a candidate or a party, it's your duty. It would be journalistic crime to withhold it. Then I heard, quote, you should have waited until you had something on Trump so you could be balanced. But it doesn't work that way. The DNC emails had information that was newsworthy, and definitely it should have been published prior to the election. And that's the end of it. It doesn't really matter where it came from. It's not the concern of the journalist to disregard information because it comes from some source that might have an agenda. You always have to evaluate information that is in front of you. It is in the public interest is it in the public interest to publish it? It's a no-brainer. Either it is or it isn't. And turning to the Roger Stone's indictment, Kristen said to the Reykjavik Grapevine, quote, "If you read through Stone's indictment, and it's only 23 pages long, it's basically a confirmation that there was no communication between Roger Stone and Julian Assange," Kristen says. "Stone claimed that there had been. He was trying to elevate his position. He's a player in that circle. It's Roger Stone." In fact, Kristen says, quote, "The only communications that arguably took place between them was a direct message on Twitter in January 2017, where WikiLeaks asked Roger Stone to please stop making the claims that you had access to Julian Assange and had communicated with him because it didn't exist." With regards to the Cohen testimony, Kristen points out that WikiLeaks is mentioned only once, when Cohen said that he was present when Roger Stone called Trump and that he had just talked to Julian Assange. So what's the proof that Trump knew Stone had talked to Julian Assange and therefore there's a direct connection? It's a claim. You're going to take at face value something Roger Stone is saying at the same time that you're charging him with lying to investigators. And Kristen continues in the article saying there's a silencing epidemic going on that is part of what I'm referencing to as near McCarthyism, he says. The war on journalism will probably escalate somewhat further. I don't really expect the mainstream journalism community to see the danger that is looming and why it is absolutely necessary to wake up now and support Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and Chelsea Manning. Things will probably get worse before they get better, but I have to try to be an optimist. It did take some years for the mainstream media to come to terms with the fact that we have been lied to about the reasons for the invasion of Iraq. And Kristen pointed out that famed journalist and personal friend John Pilger had pointed out that all the major stories about abuse of power, the after effects of the bombing of Hiroshima, the My Lai massacre, the crack and CIA connection, were all broken by smaller, more independent media outlets, indicating that smaller journals perhaps reflect a sort of light at the end of the tunnel. That said, with so many sources to choose from, how are readers supposed to know who to trust? And Kristen says, quote, "People will simply have to be more critical. They will have to learn to trust certain news outlets, never fully though. But you should read news outlets with a critical mind. Take into account the influence that might be behind the reporting. Do you trust BBC when it's reporting on the British intelligence community? Do you trust Russia Today when they're reporting on Putin? Do you trust Al Jazeera when they're reporting on Qatar? You should take everything with a grain of salt and learn how to put together a somewhat unsorted picture of what is going on in the world. But you should also demand proof and say, show me the documents, demand the evidence, demand transparency." And that was the end of the quotations from the Reykjavik Grapevine's article and their interview with Kristen Hafrenson, the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks. This week, the Courage Foundation also published the Assange precedent, which is well worth reading in full. I may, as we go through the rest of this vigil, I may share screen and show you all that precedent because I think it's definitely good to look at. They have a number of charts that would be difficult to just read to you. So for that reason, I may share a screen. But as we conclude this week's headlines and shift into today's discussion, a reminder to all of our listeners that in less than a week, on March 28th, it will be 1 year since Assange was silenced and gagged within the Ecuadorian embassy. And in light of that, I ask all of you to consider stepping up your advocacy and activism in the next week. I mean, I know that lots of you are already doing the absolute maximum that you can, but I still think it's important to recognize the importance of that upcoming kind of landmark in the ongoing gagging of Assange. And we need to raise as much awareness as possible regarding this unjust prosecution of a truth teller in Julian Assange, as well as the unfair recent, re-imprisonment of Chelsea Manning for the likely purpose of coercing her to implicate Assange in a conspiracy regarding the information that she leaked to WikiLeaks in 2010. And so with that said, I believe that we should have some guests coming on shortly. And for a moment, I'm going to ask our tech friends to actually play our intro loop of music for just a few minutes while I get up to date on the latest tweets and events that are happening live from WikiLeaks right now. And then I'll be able to come back and read them to you. So just a moment and I will be right back.
There is unity in the oppression. There must be absolute unity and determination in the response.
Thank you for sticking with us, everyone. Again, I'm Elizabeth Voss. I am a co-founder and co-host of the Unity 4J Vigils, and we don't have any panelists with us at the moment. As I said earlier, Joe Laurier will be back with us next week, and we will obviously be trying out, we will be definitely devoting special attention to the fact that it will have been a year at that point by next week that Julian Assange will have been gagged and silenced. But at the moment, I would like to have a discussion with you all that are in the live chat at the moment. And if you have any questions or comments on the latest developments, whether it's the Twitter censorship and restriction of the account of Christine Assange, whether it's the latest events at the embassy with the increase of plainclothes British police officers and the unusual travel of this jet to London, whether it's any of the interviews and articles that I discussed earlier, I'd like to hear from you and answer any questions or thoughts that you all have, because I think it's been an eventful week and it's obviously a very important time right now in the developing sort of events that we're seeing. I know it'll take a few minutes for people to type in any questions or comments, but I would like to kind of open up the floor to you all to sort of be our panelists today. Is Chelsea Manning allowed visitors? As far as I know, I am not privy to that information. I would assume so, but I don't know the answer to that question at this time. I think that it's likely, as far as I understand, I don't know that she is in solitary confinement or any isolated situation like that. I would assume that her lawyers are still allowed access to her. Yeah, and Aresh says that Ms. Assange also sent out an interesting tweet to Hillary following the New Zealand incident, just to put it out there. Yeah, I saw that, and it was very odd, the timing of the restriction of Christine Assange, just in the sense that she had been, as Consortium News recognized, she had been replying to Hillary Clinton, she had been replying to John Bolton and figures like that. And it was also interesting that just following her restriction, that Telesur was also restricted. So it begs the question, in my opinion, was this simply because the accounts were tweeting a lot, or was it politically motivated censorship? And I think it would probably lean towards the latter. Just looking at any other further questions. Yeah, of course. One person says, I would assume that visitors would have to be approved since it's a federal prison. Absolutely. I would assume that the normal procedure is in place in that sense. Someone asked, is there anyone standing vigil at the embassy? As far as I know, the normal vigils are ongoing at the embassy. There are usually people there, which I would assume would all be, having their eyes open on what's happening. We know that from WikiLeaks tweet that the lawyers, Julian Assange's lawyers, were observing the increased police presence, unfortunately, but that's where we're getting that information. There are a number of different groups that do regular vigils at the embassy in an ongoing way, whether it's the vigils led by Greek Emmy on Twitter, or whether it's spontaneous actions on the ground, or whether it's the World Socialist website and the Socialist Equality Party and their shows of support. There are lots of different groups and events that are ongoing at the embassy and around the world, of course. Restream bot says, can you please repeat the information on the threat to Julian Assange? Well, I don't know that I would term it a threat, but there's just been ongoing developments very recently where WikiLeaks tweeted, and I will pull up the tweet this moment. In the last 24 hours, they tweeted that a jet that it was jet N996GA. It's a U.S. Department of Justice jet, and it flew to London in Tuesday from DC and was last noted rendering alleged Russian hacker Yevgeny Nikulin to the US last year from the Czech Republic, causing a diplomatic incident with Russia. And then obviously just following that, within 24 hours, Julian Assange's lawyers have reported seeing an increase in plainclothed British police officers and their presence at the embassy. So obviously that is very concerning, and it's something that Christine Assange tweeted about, as I read to you all earlier, saying, is this an attempt to pick up Julian Assange? I don't know the answer to that. We can't know, but it's definitely something to pay close attention to. especially as the news cycle is basically occupied elsewhere. So it's definitely concerning. Can we get, Brian Cosby asked, can we get anyone from the UN to speak with Unity4J? I think that's a great idea. We would very much like to speak with anyone from the UN that would be willing to speak to us. I'm sure that in the meantime, journalists that are supportive of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are continuing to reach out to individuals in institutions, including the UN. But we also know that the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention already ruled in Assange's favor years ago. So that, that is an important ruling from a UN working group. In his case, he's won many court cases in his favor. Unfortunately, those court cases, like the Inter-American Court, there's no enforcement mechanism in the United States to make their sort of persecution and prosecution of Assange stop. So Aresh Jamal is sharing some tweets from WikiLeaks, and I appreciate that. Yeah, and we also saw in the last few hours and few minutes, we've seen WikiLeaks publish a pre-commitment hash. So that's also of interest. That's within the last hour. You can see that on their Twitter feed. I'll also share it in chat. And I appreciate you all asking questions and adding comments. I think it's a great opportunity for all of you to not just feel, but actually be included. And if there's any ideas you all have about ways that other listeners and viewers could increase their activism over the next week and weeks, that would be helpful as well. Absolutely. Restreambot says, for those who are new, will you tell those where to go to find out how to get more involved? Absolutely. You can go to the Unity4J Discord if you'd like to participate in the Unity4J sort of centered events, but you can also express activism and express support individually by all means. You can also go to justiceforassange.com, I believe, and defend WikiLeaks. And that brings up one of the things that I wanted to show you all and actually share my screen to show you is the Courage Foundation's publication of this PDF titled The Assange Precedent, The Threat to the Media Posed by Trump's Prosecution of Julian Assange. And it's a very helpful document that I'll share with you in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to make sure that I have the URLs right that I'm giving you all, as far as like Justice for Assange, etc. One second. And obviously, there are also ongoing compilations of coverage from the Courage Foundation and also from the World Socialist website. They actually have a compilation that was tweeted recently, I believe, by the Courage Foundation, where in that compilation, they're just recording all of these different shows of solidarity and support for Julian Assange around the world. Yeah, so one of the links that any new viewers or listeners should be made aware of is defend.wikileaks.org. And I'll be linking that shortly in chat for you all. That is a great resource for anyone who wants to support Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. One second. And you can also, there's also a GoFundMe that I believe is still ongoing to support WikiLeaks in its legal procedure against The Guardian for its false publication of a false story about Manafort meeting with Assange that The Guardian has yet to retract. So that is another method of support that viewers and listeners can show for WikiLeaks and Assange. I'm just trying to bring up the link to that as well to post it in chat for you all. Okay, fundraiser by the Courage Foundation. Help WikiLeaks sue The Guardian over the Manafort story. That is a great method of support. But as I said, I'll show you all this PDF that I mentioned by the Courage Foundation that was published recently. One second. Okay. So we're looking at Opera, and which the browser I'm using, but we're looking at the Courage Foundation's PDF, the Assange precedent, the threat to the media posed by Trump's prosecution of Julian Assange, precedent with profound implications for press freedom. And we have quotes that they've compiled from the New York Times, from David McGraw, the lead lawyer for the New York Times, and from The Atlantic. And the New York Times quote says, an indictment centering on the publication of information from public interest would create a precedent with profound implications for press freedoms. Mr. Assange is not a traditional journalist, but what he does at WikiLeaks has also been difficult to distinguish in a legally meaningful way from what traditional news organizations like the New York Times do every day: seek out and publish information that officials would prefer to keep secret, to be kept secret, including classified national security matters. And obviously, David McGraw, lead lawyer for the New York Times, said that he thinks the prosecution of Assange would be a very, very bad precedent for publishers. From that incident, from everything I know, he's sort of in a classic publisher's position, and I think the law would have a very hard time drawing a distinction between the New York Times and WikiLeaks. The Atlantic stated, if the US government can prosecute the WikiLeaks editor for publishing classified material, then every media outlet is at risk. And the PDF goes on to say that the Trump administration has confirmed it has charged WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, and that if it seeks his extradition from the United Kingdom, the charges relate to WikiLeaks' 2010 to 2011 joint publications on war, diplomacy, and rendition with a range of media organizations. These were published in Europe while Julian Assange was in Europe. In the US, Assange faces life in prison. The alleged source at Chelsea Manning, who was granted a commutation by President Obama, was re-jailed on March 8th, 2019 by the Trump administration to coerce her to testify in secret against WikiLeaks over the 2010 publications. On her jailing, she stated, quote, that I stand by my previous public testimony. In her 2013 trial, Manning stated that the decisions that she made to send documents and information to WikiLeaks were her own. The Trump administration's actions are a serious threat to freedom of expression and freedom of the media. And as the Courage Foundation states in its PDF, the case raises fundamental issues. Number one, the Trump administration is seeking to use its case against WikiLeaks as an icebreaker to crush the rest of the press. The administration is seeking to end the rash of leaks about it by using the case against WikiLeaks as an icebreaker against the rest of the media. The administration has been plagued by hundreds of government leaks on everything from Trump's conversations with the leaders of Australia and Mexico to Jared Kushner's security clearance to an upcoming meeting with Kim Jong-un to his personal diary, etc. In fact, the Trump administration has already threatened to prosecute journalists publishing classified leaks. The Trump administration is hostile to the press and will not stop at WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is the desired precedent setter to hobble the rest of the press. And prosecuting WikiLeaks is a severe precedent-setting threat to press freedoms, as we've obviously discussed in the many articles that we looked at earlier in this segment of this vigil. So if the US succeeds in prosecuting the publisher and editor of WikiLeaks for the revealing information the US says is secret, it will open the floodgates to an extremely dangerous precedent. Not only will the US government immediately seize on the precedent to initiate further prosecutions, states the world over will follow suit and claim that their secrecy laws must apply globally too. Assange's co-publishers at Der Spiegel, Le Monde, New York Times, Espresso, and The Guardian, among others, will also risk immediate prosecution in and extradition to the US. The prosecution of Assange will have a profound chilling effect on the press and national security reporting. Publishers should not be prosecuted in the US or elsewhere for the crime of publishing truthful information. The third point here is that the Trump administration should not be able to prosecute a journalist in the UK operating from the UK and the rest of Europe over claims under US laws. The extradition and prosecution of Assange would pose an invitation to other states to follow suit, severely threatening the ability of journalists, publishers, and human rights organizations to safely reveal information about serious international issues. If the Trump administration can prosecute an Australian journalist in Europe for publishing material in the US, why can't Russia prosecute an American journalist in Washington revealing secrets about Moscow? Why can't Saudi Arabia prosecute a Turkish journalist for revealing secrets about the Khashoggi murder? while the Assange precedent established, foreign states will have grounds to insist journalists and publishers are extradited for their reporting. Even in states that bar the extradition of their citizens, as soon as the journalist goes on holiday or on assignment, they can be arrested and extradited from a third state using the Assange precedent. And the fourth point here in this PDF is that the Trump administration seeks to to turn Europe and the rest of the world into a legal Guantanamo Bay, saying the US seeks to apply its laws to European journalists and publishers and at the same time strip them of constitutional rights, effectively turning Europe into a legal Guantanamo Bay, where US criminal laws are asserted, but US rights are withheld. In April 2017, CIA Director Mike Pompeo said that Julian Assange has no First Amendment privileges and he is not a US citizen. He stated that we have to recognize that we can no longer allow Assange and his colleagues the latitude to use free speech values against us. To give them the space to crush us with misappropriated secrets is a perversion of what our great Constitution stands for. It ends now. And obviously, that, just as an aside, that obviously was a statement made, I believe, less than a month after WikiLeaks published the Vault 7 documents, which were obtained from, which were originated with the CIA and obviously deeply embarrassed the CIA. But continuing with the PDF, it says that while rejecting any rights under the First Amendment, which guarantees free speech and freedom of the media under the US Constitution, the US believes it still has a right to prosecute a non-US publisher in Europe. And then we have a quote from Alan Rusbriger, former editor of The Guardian, saying, journalists, whatever they think of Julian Assange, should defend his First Amendment rights. And James Goodale, as I mentioned earlier, wrote this article in, I believe, Harper's Magazine, which I won't read again because I believe I've already read it to you all, but which other publishers and journalists are also in the frame? WikiLeaks co-published the Afghanistan and Iraq files in 2010 with a range of media organizations. The co-publishers of the Afghanistan material were Der Spiegel, the New York Times, the Guardian, and Espresso. The co-publishers of the Iraq material were Der Spiegel, the Guardian, the New York Times, Al Jazeera, Le Monde, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, Channel 4's Dispatches, the Iraq Body Count Project, RUV from Iceland, and SVT from Sweden. The individual journalists reporting the Afghanistan and Iraq material are identified in the chart that we see below. And so it really is something that is never discussed in establishment media of late, the direct implications that the prosecution of WikiLeaks would have on all of these journalists and all of these outlets, not just in general, like not just as a tool of the Trump administration to go after the press, but directly for their participation with WikiLeaks in publishing this material. It's really, not just an abandonment of Assange, but, as we've said, many times, it's a betrayal of journalistic integrity and principles in general. It is astounding that we see journalists like Jim Acosta being lauded as brave journalists for having conflict with President Trump in the White House press corps, but we don't have anyone standing up for Assange when this is the type of serious implications that his persecution of him could have for themselves and for the entire press, as many of the journalists and the articles that I read earlier discussed, and as WikiLeaks and the Courage Foundation are discussing here. And their PDF says that the Guardian published hundreds of documents in full in various sets, often using those exposés as major headlines, as did the other papers. The New York Times published WikiLeaks war logs as an archive of classified military documents offering views of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Re-reported coverage of WikiLeaks files by other media organizations is, of course, even more extensive. Hundreds of outlets reported on the files, often quoting them extensively. Some of these news organizations published dozens of files in full with interactive maps and facilities to search the documents, such as the Telegraph in the UK. All major newspapers prominently covered by the WikiLeaks publication of thousands of CIA files in March 2017, the biggest leak in the history of the CIA and the stimulus of the Trump administration to shut down WikiLeaks. The fact that the media freedom, that media freedom under threat is recognized by a raft of organizations is, extensively discussed in these quotes that are in this box here in the PDF that continue into the next page. it's absolutely astounding the degree to which so many, US outlets and international outlets will use the WikiLeaks documents, but then will not support Assange in the current circumstances apparently after a change of heart in 2016. As we've discussed previously on these vigils, it has to be said again that the prosecution of Assange and persecution of Assange and WikiLeaks, and now also the jailing of Chelsea Manning, is all to do with classified material, mostly published in 2010, mostly and possibly also to do with Vault 7, but not in regards to the Podesta emails and the DNC emails published in 2016. It has nothing to do with the Mueller investigation. And for that reason, it's really significant that all of these outlets who lauded Assange and WikiLeaks for publishing material that was embarrassing to the Bush administration continue to not support Assange and WikiLeaks, despite the fact that it is that material that they lauded WikiLeaks for that is, in the main is responsible for the current and ongoing persecution of WikiLeaks. And as you all can see on the screen, we've got quotes from Dinah Pokempner, General Counsel from Human Rights Watch. There are quotes from David Kay, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression, Kenneth Roth, Director of Human Rights Watch, David Barlow, an attorney with The Intercept, Alexandra Ellerbeck, a committee to protect journalists and the North America Program Coordinator, Trevor Tim, Director of Freedom of the Press Foundation, and Bruce Shapiro, contributing editor to The Nation, as well as Ben Weisner from the ACLU. And I want to add as well that it's in recent weeks, we saw the removal of the Intercept's Snowden files that they had published on their website, which obviously were a very small percentage of the total Snowden files that were submitted to them. And in the current media landscape, in the current situation, I think that really is a further indictment of establishment press being unwilling to bear the pressure of the state power that is really fighting back and prosecuting and persecuting those who reveal their secrets. And I think that Chris Hedges, in the article that we discussed earlier, did a great job talking about the way in which the state and establishment power structures are really fighting back against transparency and against any of us having the ability to understand the real machinations of power in the Western world. So obviously the situation right now is tenuous and ongoing, and I hope that that all of us will feel empowered to enact activism in the best way that we can and not be cowed into silence, even if establishment media will not do their job. In response to establishment media not doing their job, we must stand up and become the media ourselves. So I'm just taking a look really fast at chat to see what's going on there and answer any more questions or statements that you all might have. Aresh says, Elizabeth, you mentioned the problem about other media publishing WikiLeaks documents. What about the court cases you mentioned months ago? How would that work? That's the question. That's the danger of this ongoing prosecution, is that there is no limitation to the precedent that this sets for other media outlets now and in the future. It becomes, basically, as far as I understand it, it becomes possible for the U.S. Legal authorities to criminalize foreign news outlets and correspondents from discussing international news subjects. I mean, can you imagine if any, like the Telegraph, the Guardian, international papers and journalists were prosecuted for simply discussing the information published by WikiLeaks and sourced from Chelsea Manning? It would be an absolute nightmare, but that's what we're looking at. I mean, we have this what seems to be a faux movement of resistance against Trump. But when it comes to his actual persecution of the press and free press, there is almost complete silence. It's kind of mind-blowing. So I'm looking at the rest of the chat. Is anyone concerned about New Zealand? It's moving through once Intercept took outside funding Yeah, I think that the Intercept's removal of the Snowden files from their site is a very sad statement on the state of establishment media. It's a shame that the Intercept, as a site that almost was founded as with the Snowden files as their kind of flagship publication, would remove them from public view. It's completely the opposite of the type of transparency that WikiLeaks provides us, and it's a very sad development to see. I'm just reading the rest of your comments. Yeah, there are comments to the effect that the case against Assange isn't political ideology or ideologically motivated, but because of the political corruption trying to save themselves and allow that corruption to continue. So, ergo, any reporter reporting on corruption is also open to the JA treatment. I completely agree. And I think that the moral fortitude of people like Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning is incredible and an example to all of us. They didn't wait for somebody else to report properly. They've made a stand themselves, and they've suffered greatly because of that. And I think in light of that, we have an absolute duty to stand up as best we can for them and to fight against the censorship of WikiLeaks and the persecution of Julian Assange, the ongoing coercion against Chelsea Manning. Yeah, and one comment says that the WikiLeaks revealed that CIA lost control of their cyber warfare tools. Absolutely. And one point about that is that, as Aresh says, this makes the US vulnerable, and that China, among others, somehow may have had info on them, but this makes WikiLeaks an enemy of the US, which does not make sense. Exactly. So the release of these, Vault 7, the CIA, in my personal opinion, should have been thankful to WikiLeaks for that publication, because it shows the vulnerability of the CIA. It shows that they had dangerously lost control of their own malware and tools, and the fact is also that WikiLeaks did redact and did make sure not to publish working versions of this malware so that they would be putting it in the hands of the public. They very responsibly released the information without releasing it in such a way that it would be harmful. So the fact that the CIA responded in the way that it did is very, it's not saddening, but it's very indicative of the attitude amongst US intelligence agencies towards exposure of their own inadequacies, for sure. And what did one person asked, what did the press do to help before 2016? I think that's a great question. I don't know that there was a lot of, active attempts to help Julian Assange and WikiLeaks before 2016. And there were definitely establishment journalists even before 2016 that were very anti-WikiLeaks, anti-Assange, calling for his arrest, calling for his death, and that type of thing. But I would say that, just as an outside observer, it seems that the tide of establishment media opinion very much shifted against WikiLeaks and Julian Assange once they announced that they had DNC emails to publish, et cetera, and we saw the publication of the Podesta emails as well. Another person says, if Julian Assange isn't granted his rightful freedom, one can see the ugly trajectory for freedom of speech and press bending lower to where men and women speaking inconvenient truth face imprisonment. And that's absolutely right. That's a great comment. Thank you for adding that to the conversation. I completely agree. And it's really shameful to see the United States, which claims to have this quality of exceptionalism based on the Constitution, based on the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, being the foremost prosecutor of and persecutor of actual transparency and free press that exists on the planet today. So I think that that's definitely something to consider. And another comment says that Vault 7 also saved big tech companies by informing them about vulnerabilities of their products, saved them from who knows what costs. That's a great point. And another commenter says, if you can't hold power to account, power will walk right over you. Definitely. And I think that there's the cliched saying that nonetheless is true. It's that when exposing crime is treated as a crime, then you're ruled by criminals. I think that that's exactly right. And it goes back to that article that we read, that I read to you all by Chris Hedges, about Chelsea Manning, and about the fact that Chelsea Manning should have been a witness for the prosecution of those who were guilty and participated in war crimes, who were shown to have conducted so much illegal behavior in the 500,000 documents that Chelsea Manning leaked to the public. I think that it is such a reversal of justice, and it is such a reversal of the proper course of things that she is now back in jail because she refuses to participate in a grand jury process that is secret and that does not allow her a defense. It's ridiculous that she is in this position and was jailed in the first place and imprisoned in the first place as a result of doing the right thing morally and following her conscience. I'm just reading some more of your comments. It's great to see you all participating with us today. And yes, somebody said that the permanent deep state is the big mafia empire. I think that the way in which we see the corrupt going out of their way to protect their corruption rather than to cleanse it from the system does show that this is the status quo that the powerful and really do want to continue, and that's what they're trying to protect by killing off any attempt at real transparency. Yeah, and Aresh Jamal from the Daily Star in Bangladesh, thank you for being part of this live stream. I really appreciate it. And he says, what about Trump himself quoting WikiLeaks during his campaign? If WikiLeaks can be prosecuted for publishing documents putting other media and NGOs at risk, doesn't that make Trump liable too for reading them publicly? That's a really interesting question. I think that would be something to follow up on. I don't know, because I am not a lawyer and I can't, legally speak to those issues, but I think it's a really interesting point. And Bernadette asks, is WikiLeaks still able to publish? Yes, they are. It looks like they have published a pre-commitment hash, meaning that there will be some upcoming publications, and they have published documents since 2016. They have been continuing to publish, and they will continue to do so as far as I'm aware going forward. And another comment states that Pompeo used WikiLeaks during the Benghazi hearings as well. That's another great point. It's interesting to see so many, members of the establishment and the U.S. authorities and the now, the former CIA director, switching in this way. Like, for example, what Aresh brought up about Trump switching from reading WikiLeaks and praising WikiLeaks on the campaign trail to prosecuting WikiLeaks, and Jeff Sessions saying that the arrest of Julian Assange was a priority. I do think that's very concerning, and it's something to be aware of, that we see so many politicians before they get into office and into power saying that they are anti-war, anti-corruption, all of these different things, and then they get into office and they completely switch. And it seems that unless we have more outlets like WikiLeaks, unless we have more brave whistleblowers and brave journalists out there, that these people that have been placed into these positions of power and switched their positions will continue to do so without question and without anyone, holding them to account. And Greek Emmy is with us in the chat as well, and she's saying that she's tweeted for WikiLeaks supporters to gather between 3 and 5 p.m., but many regular vigils and vigil attendees will start coming in the morning. Thank you, Greek Emmy, for participating in the chat and letting us know. I'm going to go visit your Twitter timeline very quickly and post any call-outs that you've posted for vigils at the embassy. I think that's really important for people to participate in now if they possibly can. And we also know that the Socialist Equality Party in Australia has maintained ongoing support for Julian Assange for a very long time, and they are continuing to also have vigils in Australia. So if you're in Australia and you would like to support Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning, I would urge you to check out the Socialist Equality Party's at least their Twitter and Facebook pages, their website, and follow there. And I know that the World Socialist website, as I said earlier, has published a compilation of all of the actions that the Socialist Equality Party and others have undertaken in the last few weeks. So I'm just now posting Emmy's tweet into the chat for you all about the upcoming vigil in the next few days. And as I mentioned earlier, the buildup that WikiLeaks mentions of plainclothes, earpiece-wearing operatives outside the Ecuadorian embassy in London in the last 2 days, just after we see this jet, mysteriously fly from DC to London, that was previously used in an overnight, swift, and unannounced extradition of a alleged Russian hacker. I think that is very concerning and something that everyone listening and watching should keep an eye on and watch for any new developments in. And I'm trying to find the compilation of World Socialist website actions. There's a really great page they've put together that is ongoing and it's being updated live. So I'm just going to grab that for you all and also place it into chat. Forgive me for some of the unorthodox and unorganized, unfolding of this vigil today. It's kind of off the cuff because of circumstances outside of all of our control. We'll be back to normal next week as best as we can possibly be, and we will be obviously wanting to talk about the fact that it will have been over a year since Julian Assange has been silenced. Definitely. Sorry for the silence. I'm just looking for that updated live page, and it's just taking forever. My apologies. Oh, we have an attendee with us, it looks like. Jose Rivera. I'll bring him on now. 1 second. And as we bring on Jose, I want to say that the Socialist Equality Party in the US is also having a lot of student events in support of Assange. So that's also something to keep in mind and continue to support and participate in. Jose, can you hear us? Are you with us? I will bring on Jose as soon as he's gotten his technical issues sorted. 1 moment.
Am I okay now?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now. We can't see you, though. It looks like your camera is covered. There we are.
Okay. Yeah.
We can't see you. We can see a picture, though.
Yes.
Okay, is that how you prefer it to be?
Yes, because of security reasons.
Okay, that's fine. Just wanted to make sure.
It's not safe for me to show my
Okay,
face.
that's not a problem at all. I just wanted to make sure. Appreciate your presence. Can you tell us a little bit about your background for the viewers who haven't seen you on the vigils before? Could you explain a little bit about your background and your involvement in support for WikiLeaks, to whatever extent that you feel comfortable talking about it?
Well, I've been actually fighting the system since I was since the Reagan years. So I've been through all these U.S. presidents that have imposed the U.S. agenda in Latin America. So I've been fighting all of them. So here I am fighting them. Doing the injustice to Assange, and it happens that Assange is in Ecuador, in the Ecuadorian embassy. And as an Ecuadorian citizen, we cannot allow, the treatment that he's been given by the Ecuadorian government, Lenin Moreno, who is friendly to the United States. So that's my more or less my background.
That is incredible. Thank you for joining us. And I agree that it's incredible the way in which the establishment has continued to pressure Ecuador to give over Assange. What has it been like watching that from within Ecuador and the shift in policies on Assange from Rafael Correa's government to the government of Lenin Moreno?
Well, we have a president who all of a sudden turned around and declared himself a neoliberal guy, following orders from the United States. So right now Lenin Moreno is basically trading money and for loans from approval from the United States to be given loans, and also the Chevron case is also here, has been put in the bag too. So from the beginning, the U.S. administration put Assange, Chevron, and the loans from the IMF. That's basically what I can see that they put in a bag. So so I guess they told Lenin Moreno, if you want the loans, you have to give us Assange. You have to solve the Chevron problem, and that's what he's been doing.
Could you explain a little bit more to viewers about the Chevron problem, so that if they're unaware or unfamiliar with that they understand what that is referring to?
Yes, in the 1970s, Ecuador began to exploit the oil from the Amazon region. So Texaco, at that time, it was Occidental Petroleum, and then Texaco was exploiting the oil fields in the Amazon River, in the Amazon jungle. So they were supposed to build these pools of oil waste byproduct, but the codes, the building codes to do that, for example, in the United States, the same oil production, they would build, good pools to put all the waste there. But in the Amazon, they didn't do that. They just made them out of dirt. So with time, with in the Amazon, it rains torrentially, torrentially. So the oil pools began to leak until they just burst open. So there are about 1,000 or so pools like that all over the Amazon region, and they are all contaminated. The ancestral people of the Amazon that live there. So the rivers, the lakes, everything is contaminated. So they cannot drink the water. So that's why the Amazon ancestral people took Chevron. Chevron bought Texaco. So that's why the Amazon people took Chevron to court. So they had a 12 billion judgment against Chevron, and they've been doing all these kinds of things to not pay the money. They just it's already several years since that judgment against Chevron, and they go through all these tricks and using foreign courts and pay the judges and corruption all over. It's the same corruption that guarantees wars and invasions everywhere.
Absolutely.
It's the same corruption, the same people. So, and that's why they want Julian Assange and all the foreign leaders that are against that. They want them out. They take them out. So that's why Assange is Assange is, did, what nobody has done. So, he let the people of the world know what was going on, what these people were doing behind our backs. So that's why they want to, shut him up.
That absolutely, and I think what you point out as well is so important to remember is the power imbalance and the, as you say, corruption that is not only affecting the Amazonian people and the Amazonian ecosystems, but equally has been the premise or the pretext for so many wars across the Middle East and across the world, and so much intervention. So absolutely, it's connected to absolutely everything else as well. As you say, the same corruption.
Yes, yeah. This week just came out the lawyer for the Amazon people. He just came out. He put out a tweet that Lenin Moreno sent a secret letter to Canada to I tweeted about it. I don't remember very well, but guaranteeing, the Chevron case will be solved.
Wow.
So there you have it.
Yeah, exactly. What is it like? What is the feeling among Ecuadorians in Ecuador about Julian Assange, about WikiLeaks, and about Lenin Moreno's policies towards them?
Well, right now, the Lenin Moreno's in the polls, he is at almost 0%.
Wow.
Especially now that the corruption allegations against him just blew up in the social media, because the newspapers have not published anything, or all the news media have not published anything about the corruption case against him. So he has now court cases in Spain, Panama, and here he has a case one in Ecuador. But the court in Ecuador is not moving. It's not moving. It's not moving. So his popularity is just zero.
Yeah, and it's so shocking as an outsider, as somebody who's been watching this development and the policies, the changes in his policies over the course of his presidency so far. I remember when supporters of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange were celebrating that Moreno won, because he was supposed to be, or was thought to be, the more supportive of the two candidates for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. I believe his opponent had promised to essentially kick Julian Assange out of the embassy. So it's definitely a shame to have seen his presidency take the course that it has, and essentially just obey the wishes and pressure of the United States. But
yes, well, you remember? I don't remember if one of the WikiLeaks releases was the Abu Ghraib, tortures and all those things that happened in Abu Ghraib.
Yeah.
Did any court ever in the United States ever condemn any of these people to make?
Not to my knowledge.
No.
Not to my knowledge.
No, they are walking free, criminals, because these are war criminals. They are just walking free in the United States.
Absolutely. No, and I think that again, like that brings up that fundamental point that instead of the the perpetrators of these crimes being prosecuted properly for the crimes they've committed, that they've been exposed committing, over and over again, whether it's John Kiriakau exposing the torture program of the CIA and being the only one prosecuted, or whether it's Chelsea Manning exposing war crimes and being the only one prosecuted in relation to all of that exposure. We just see over and over again that it is the criminals who are protected and the truth tellers who are prosecuted. Do you see that type of thing as well happening in Ecuador? Are there local examples or national examples of that as well?
Yes, well, the court, because Lenin Moreno controls the justice system and the National Assembly, which is like the Congress of the United States. So he controls them. So they are protecting him. They are protecting not just him, but a whole mafia in government. This mafia that was just waiting, there to take their, for their place to come, after Rafael Correa. And you see, there's all this mafia. This is just that they make up a whole mafia, in the whole world. They all know each other. The multi-billionaires, they all know each other. And they all, they all own stocks in the war-making factories.
That seems to be the situation.
And the judges are the same.
Yeah.
The judge in Virginia that would supposedly see Assange. I think there's a lady. If one thinks about it, this judge in Virginia, she is protecting a mafia.
Absolutely, and it seems that type of corruption, as you say, is going on, whether it's in Ecuador or whether it's in the United States or in relation to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. It seems to be, unfortunately, commonplace and prevalent across the world, and especially in the West as well, where we have these plutocrats and this plutocratic class forming this corrupt power structure that protects itself. And part of that, obviously, as we're saying, is to prosecute those who expose their crimes. And we have a tweet I'm going to just share in the chat. If you are able to, please go to the rally on March 31st. This obviously just coming up in New York at 12 p.m. That would be great. So I'm just going to share that very quickly. But Jose, I'd like to ask you, what have you seen any sort of change, or are there any, if there are any other viewers and listeners that are in Ecuador, are there any groups that are kind of demonstrating in support of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, or is there kind of a public sentiment that of support for them?
No, there hasn't been any demonstrations. Apart from the one that there was, several months ago in favor of him. Remember when one of the representatives went to make a protest to evict Assange in front of the presidential palace, and we made a counter protest. In the end, they had to leave the plaza because they lost the. We outnumbered them.
I would expect so, and I think that there have also been many Ecuadorians who I know I've seen pictures and video of them supporting and showing up outside the Ecuadorian embassy in London to support Assange there. So that's been really inspiring to see. Absolutely.
Yes, I'm in contact with the Ecuadorian group in London. So. I usually write to them when there is a chance for a protest or something like that at the embassy. So apart from that, there has not been any, because you see, all the focus right now is in this coming Sunday election.
Right.
So the whole people are focusing on that, and Lenín Moreno is trying to, make all these tricks on the, pushing electoral laws at the last minute to curtail, the vote. So for example, he just eliminated from the voting rolls more than 100,000 foreign nationals who were entitled to vote. He just took them off the rolls.
Wow.
Yeah,
that is incredible.
Yes, because they usually they vote progressive for Correa party, you see. So they didn't want their vote to show up in the elections.
That is incredible.
Yes.
Switching topics a little bit, do you, as an activist yourself, and as somebody who's been an activist, as you say, for decades on various issues related to this type of corruption, do you have any advice for the viewers and listeners of this Vigil on how they can, empower themselves and become activists, what they can do to help and support Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and generally this kind of cause for transparency and against corruption?
Well, I think if we are all the people who are watching the vigil and also are always present at the in social media, I think we were born to protest the system, and we must keep fighting because nobody else is going to do it if we don't do it. It's as simple as that. We just have to do it because nobody else is going to do it but us.
Definitely, absolutely. And I think one thing that people have to remember that I've written a number of times and I've said in previous vigils, but it's been long enough that maybe some viewers and listeners didn't hear it at the time, is that everyone has a different situation. They're in different places. They have different tools and abilities that they have access to, whether it's, money that you can donate to Assange or Chelsea Manning's defense, whether it is, like an ability to, like, let's say someone who's a singer songwriter who can make music, whether it's somebody who is a journalist who can raise their voice in support, or whether it's somebody who simply has a large network of friends who they can talk to and spread the message of what is actually going on in regards to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange versus the lies of establishment press. Everyone has something that they can contribute to this sort of effort.
Exactly. For example, a lot of times you can get this news, for example, in the right wing population by showing them, for example, I'll just give you an example, the video footage of what WikiLeaks showed, the killing from the helicopter.
Right, of collateral murder, yes.
Introduce points like that you are not talking about politics, you're not talking about, and then they are going to ask questions naturally, and that's when where you put your ideas, without saying, that you are from the left or something like that.
Absolutely. I think that it's important that people, not just on the right, but on the left, raise their voices. And I think that's been a definite problem, is that a lot of left-wing outlets have been persuaded against WikiLeaks simply because of the events of 2016. And I think that's really short-sighted and a shame. And I hope that changes in the near future when people understand that this is, that this is going to be the Trump administration that is actually going after journalists via this, Assange precedent, via the persecution of WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning and the rest.
Well, yes. Well, a lot of, so-called left-wing sites, have websites and things like that cost money. And a lot of them are just there because they need the attention, and they actually, when they actually have to fight for something, they just don't do it because their financing is going to be affected. They won't be able, for example, to pay for the website or something like that. Things like that. Or for example, a lot of the I have noticed that a lot of the right wing can, for example, how can I say?
Maybe news outlets or
no. For example, if they can put out so much information that what you are trying to focus on, it just gets lost in the mountain of information. I don't know if you get my point.
Yeah, no, I do. I understand. Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And especially with the news cycle as busy as it is, it is so easy to, stop paying attention to cases like Assange's in terms of him being gagged because it falls away from the news cycle, or it's so easy to kind of forget the situation that Chelsea Manning is now in, because she has been, silenced, and there is, maybe very little new news to report. And that is a real shame. And I think that is something that that this vigil is designed to prevent, is people forgetting and no longer paying attention to the suffering of truth tellers.
Yes, I think that's what they do. For example, if right now if we are doing something in favor of Assange, they will put out a lot of articles and things like that are progressive. But their intention is to, put a cloud so that our intention, our point being covered is just covered. And
absolutely.
And it just gets hidden,
Yeah, and lies of omission and the absence of coverage are definitely very easy ways to allow these really truly important stories to be missed, and for the public to just continue to be misinformed on these subjects. It's really unfortunate that so much of the public has been fed total misinformation about WikiLeaks, about Julian Assange, about the history of WikiLeaks. As some of the information that we read from earlier said, the U.S. authorities, the Pentagon, had to admit during the court-martial procedure of Chelsea Manning that WikiLeaks publications had not harmed national security and had not resulted in the harm of service members. And I think that's a really incredible point that, again, like you're saying, is so often, these important aspects of these cases are so often just left out and forgotten. And in that case, the public is, disadvantaged in its lack of understanding.
Well, this trick has been going on for decades. I don't know if you remember, for example, the scandals, so many scandals of so many big politicians and things like that, that they were just never made a media bomb. They were just mentioned briefly somewhere, and then that's it.
That sounds about right. I mean, given everything that we see now, I was not alive at the time of some of those events, but I've read about the corruption involved in that case and in those related stories, and it's horrendous. If you'd like to talk about that for the benefit of the viewers and listeners, I'd be glad to hear about some of either your experiences or just the situation that took place during that time.
Well, I remember, for example, the Iran-Contra affair at the U.S. Congress. It was just washed in the press, It never exploded in the press. It was just covered briefly, and Oliver North, for example, he was convicted to prison, and he was later released. And all these people are still around, and it's the big money. They all want the big money because they want to buy the big house, house in Europe, house in south of France, house in every state, in the Bahamas with nice cars. They all want to be millionaires. So they will sell their souls, and they don't care if they convict one or two people, innocent people, to get that.
Absolutely, and you mentioned that we still see these faces and names around, and that's so true when we look at figures like Elliot Abrams now being officially involved in the U.S. and sort of attempts at intervention in Venezuela, which is horrendous to anyone who knows about that history of his involvement in awful death squads and all sorts of horrendous events during the time period that we're discussing. It's again, if it wasn't for, I can't imagine the way that the history books would have been different if an organization like WikiLeaks had existed during the Iran-Contra scandal, and if that time period, if there had been a really legitimate organization that could have exposed those stories earlier. Obviously, there were a few great reporters who worked on those stories, but like you said, they were not given a voice in establishment press outlets. They were not broadcast across the entire nation, and those episodes are, conveniently left out of, the American history books when it comes to education and college classes and that type of thing as well. So it's essentially memory hold in the American public mind. But,
well, all our countries have constitutions.
right.
And it says very clearly there, most of constitutions say there that the people are the ones who decide which course democracy is going to take, the direction that is going to go. But all of a sudden, you get the corporations, you get the warmongers, they are deciding for us, you see. So, and they are not in the Constitution anywhere, you see.
Absolutely. Well, now, yeah, go ahead.
Right. So that was my point. Corporations are not in the Constitution.
Yeah, actually, I forget who it was. There was somebody who tweeted that really recently. I think it was actually Ralph Nader who said that corporations are not in the Constitution. Yeah.
Yes.
It's only we the people.
Exactly. But we the people is a joke by now, believe me.
Unfortunately. Definitely. Well, and I think, and I'm going to change the subject a little bit just to tell everyone that and this is unrelated, I think, to obviously to the build-up in plainclothes British police officers at the ground on the grounds of the Ecuadorian embassy in London. But I do want to just say that WikiLeaks has tweeted out an article from the Washington Post titled "Mueller report sent to Attorney General signaling his Russia investigation has," let me just see the rest of this as I open it, has ended. And WikiLeaks tweeted about the article saying, quote, "U.S. Attorney General Barr Mueller has concluded his investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election and related matters. No collusion indictments were made." So I think that's really important news that I wanted to just let everyone know about as well. But Jose, if you have any comments on just what you think the future may hold for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, maybe your hopes for the type of activism that people can enact and support, but also what you see maybe coming from the current Ecuadorian president and government. Do you think that that they are going to possibly totally fall under the weight of US pressure? What do you see going forward?
Well, let us remember that the ruling by the OAS Human Rights Court ordered Ecuador that they cannot evict Assange. That was a very important ruling. Very important ruling. Now, I do not know. Now, let us remember that the president of the OAS is Almagro. He's a right-wing guy. He is constantly attacking all the enemies of the United States: Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. So we don't know what's going to happen, but that ruling is very important. I think we needed that ruling to make the Assange situation at the embassy to be safer, because he has now the backing of the court from the OAS. So that is very important. So that even if the Lenin Moreno leaves his post before he finishes the term, his presidential term, as the rumors are saying here, because so the right-wing vice president will be the president. So the I don't know. I mean, they have pushed for Assange to leave the embassy, the right-wing party, but the ruling by the court from the OAS stops that. So I think that Assange is going to be safe for the time being. So we don't know what the United States is going to do. That's a problem, you see. We do not know what the United States is going to do. especially now that they are using Manning to get that. That's the way I see it. They're using Manning to get Assange evicted from the embassy.
Unfortunately, that is exactly what it looks like. All efforts are being made to do. Yes. Absolutely, it's an incredibly depressing situation. But I think that the worse that it gets at the embassy and as far as the Ecuadorian government is concerned, I think that should bolster the efforts to support Assange and to support WikiLeaks. It should increase the activism, and we should definitely not allow that to discourage us from acting in support. I think it should literally just make a stronger response amongst the public, because we've said it many times before on this vigil, but it bears repeating that Assange is essentially one of the few representatives of the public interest, because WikiLeaks, the organization he co-founded, is one of the few outlets, as Hedges in the article we wrote today, wrote, that is allowing us to peer into the machinations of those that rule us in the corrupt way that they do, as you've discussed, whether it's now or whether it's during the Iran-Contra scandal. These types of corrupt machinations of power are ongoing, worsening, and if not for Assange and WikiLeaks, we would know, there would be absolutely no way to really poke a hole in that system. But he's given us that ability, and I think that given the suffering of Chelsea Manning, given the suffering of Julian Assange that is ongoing, and the personal sacrifices that they've made in their lives, not just professionally, but in their lives overall, we are all indebted to them, and we should be doing everything that we can to support them moving forward. And I know that you know that, but I just thought it needs to be said again so that people don't get discouraged.
Yeah, there is a ray of hope, because if we win Sunday's election, especially for the government body called CPCCS, which is a special, very powerful government body, that they can even call for new elections or recall the president. So if our party wins majority in that government body, Lenín Moreno is going to be in big problems. And Rafael Correa has said that if we win this Sunday's election, he will come back to Ecuador, and Lenín Moreno will be in trouble because Correa is the most powerful politician in Ecuador.
Definitely. And what have you heard anything in news or developments regarding Lenín Moreno's attempt to actually prosecute Rafael Correa? I believe that's the last that I heard of. I haven't heard any news recently about that, but is there anything that the audience should know about that development?
Yes, Rafael Correa already has 23 legal accusations against him, because Lenín Moreno wants, you see, the Constitution says very clearly that you cannot become an elected government official or government employee if you have a corruption accusation. You see, so Lenín Moreno, has been trying to push that accusation against Correa, but none have so far been successful. So we are hoping to win this coming election, and if we do that, Lenín Moreno will be in trouble, because we can recall him easily.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I think that's really positive news in a situation where there's very often not positive news. So thank you for sharing that. I hope that is successful, and I hope that that at least in Ecuador that the will of the people is respected as far as their leaders are concerned, and their ability to oust someone who they are unsatisfied with the performance of.
Well, there is a big concern with the computer hacking of the electoral body computers that they use for the elections, because in the 2013 elections, they had more than 7,000 attempts to break into the computers. And all these attempts came out of other countries, especially the United States. So this is a big thing, important thing to see. So we do not know now that the electoral body is in the hands of Lenín Moreno. We do not know if they will open the gates for these people to do whatever they want to do in the computers.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And thank you for joining us today. It has been a rocky day with all of the, live news that's been developing and the interruption in our hosting. But I think that I really do thank you for joining us and providing your perspective from within Ecuador. It's extremely valuable to hear your experience and the perspective you have from within the country that has been so fundamentally intertwined with and supportive for a very long time of Julian Assange and has provided shelter for him for years before, as many have noted, the transformation of the refuge of asylum into a punishment of solitary confinement. So thank you. And to everyone who's watching, thank you for joining us this week. And we will be back next week to discuss this, not just to discuss the vigil, but to also focus on the fact that it will have been 1 year since Julian Assange was silenced. And although he has been allowed limited contact with the outside world, he has not been allowed to speak his mind for almost a year now. So thank you, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Buss. I'm a co-founder and co-host of the Unity 4J Vigils. And next week, Joe Lauria will be back with us as well, co-hosting. And hopefully we'll have many panelists to join us and discuss these issues. Thank you.
Bye.